Just overnight, we learned that former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was shot and killed while giving a campaign speech in the city of Nara. He was 67 years old. Abe was immediately brought to a hospital, but doctors struggled to save him. He was pronounced dead 5.5 hours after gunshots first rang out. A suspect was apprehended at the scene of the shooting. Japanese media reports that the unidentified 41-year-old man opened fire on Abe using a homemade rifle. This is the first assassination of a sitting or former Japanese premier since 1936. Abe served 2 terms as Japan's prime minister, most recently stepping down in 2020 due to poor health. Ryan, I'm eager to get your take on all of this, and particularly the breaking news out of Japan. The video footage that we have of this assassination is graphic. Abe is shot in the back. Gun violence itself is very, very rare in Japan. I think as of 2020, maybe it was 2021, only 10 people were killed by firearms in Japan in 2021. And so now you have the prime minister actually being killed by what appears to be a homemade rifle. Abe, pretty well known and pretty well respected around the world, the longest serving prime minister of Japan. What's your take?
Yeah, right. There's no question that a large-sized American city sees more gun deaths in a couple of weeks or a month than Japan sees across the entire country, across an entire year. And so the reports from Japan are that people are in shock. We know from footage from the event and from witness testimony that it was a makeshift gun, a homemade gun. The first shot appears not to have worked as well as the second one, which seems to have been the fatal blow. All we know is that the shooter had, quote, grievances with Abe. We don't know what those grievances are. Abe leaves behind a rather incredible legacy. This is a what Steve Bannon called, Trump before Trump. He was, first elected as premier back in 2006, but then elected again in 2012, and then served all the way from 2012 through 2020. So overlapped both the Obama and the Trump administrations. And Bannon and other nationalists, described him as the kind of the first, ultra nationalist of this wave to rise to the leadership position in our country and remain extraordinarily popular. He was reelected in landslides every time, and only stepped down because of health concerns. He wasn't driven from office in that direction. And he had that combination of Bannon politics, the ultra nationalism, with some economic populism mixed into it. And so it's a shock around the world. It's particularly a shock in Japan, which doesn't see gun violence, but I think it also raises the specter of whether or not we're heading into a wave of these types of assassinations around the world. What was your reaction to it?
Well, and that's what I wanted to transition the conversation to, because immediately what I started hearing from just people in my circles reacting was echoes of World War I, is what people said right away. And we forget historically sometimes that these events can be more destabilizing in time. The more we learn about motives and the more the world reacts, the stabilization that might feel, in the moment, if there's any sense of stability in the moment, it can actually be eroded over time as the world kind of reacts to the news. And the populist question is an interesting one. The wave of nationalism and populism is an interesting question when it comes to Abe, because I think, like a lot of other leaders, you can maybe even look at Boris Johnson, he doesn't fit neatly into the sort of box or the dichotomy, the political ideological dichotomy left and right, or the right populist model that we try to apply, because a lot of these populists have sort of broke that mold. And getting into this question of taking a step back and trying to understand this from a global perspective, Ryan, the world feels unstable right now. I don't think there's any question about that. When you have the news out of the UK, the American economy feels extremely unstable. The country itself feels very unstable. And now you have a shocking act of violence in one of the safest countries in the world. How do you think this reverberates in sort of geopolitics? Abe himself was a critic of China. He was not on the Chinese's best side, we'll say that much. And we don't know what motives are. We don't know any of that yet. And it may continue to develop. It likely will. But how do you think this does reverberate sort of in geopolitics over the next few weeks?
Well, we're getting reports that the Chinese government is actually working hard to tamp down celebrations in China. Right. Because it's obviously just deeply offensive at this moment for anybody to be celebrating when it goes to this kind of raw tension that existed between Abe and between the Chinese government and the Chinese people as well, because the ultra nationalism that he was a part of sometimes didn't make distinctions between people and governments around the region, and so. I think how that plays out in China certainly will affect how relations go forward. But you're right that he broke the mold of the kind of traditional kind of right-wing conservative, like the what we think of as the kind of Bush era, George H.W. or George W. Bush, for a long time around the world, and particularly in the United States and Europe and Japan, you had very similar party structures, even though you had multiple parties in some countries, two parties in this system, but you had a very similar ideological breakdown across the spectrum. And Japan in particular, faced this 20 years of basically no economic growth as the Japanese government focused on resisting any deficit spending. So there was a lot, I think there was a lot of anger that was produced, a lot of economic anxiety, as we called it over here in the United States, that was produced by this kind of lost decade or lost decades. And so Abe crafted his ultranationalism mixed in with populism, economic populism, as a reaction to that, and was able to then kind of grow because of it. And you really see, as Bannon said, you see Trump, 4 years later, really adopt a lot of the same politics, a lot of the same techniques as he did, and then you see it elsewhere around the world. Like now he's kind of created a new mold, and you can fit that mold on a lot of leaders around the world.
And I think you've already seen, in regard to Boris Johnson, sort of celebrations from the neoliberal community saying this is you cannot run. I read this in Axios this morning already. Like the takeaway here is that you can no longer campaign on Brexit and win elections, which is I mean it's an interesting perspective, and obviously this is this puts a huge damper on the movement that's sort of built up around that. But to your point about Abe, Boris Johnson was also elected in this nationalist wave. In a different sense, and that's what happens when the world is destabilized by reckless financial behavior from American elites on Wall Street and et cetera. We sort of think of the recession as being something of the past, but in so many ways we're still reeling from it. The White House put out President Biden's statement this morning on Abe. He said, "I am stunned, outraged, and deeply saddened by the news that my friend Abe Shinzo was shot and killed while campaigning. He was a champion of the alliance between our nations and the friendship between our people. The longest-serving Japanese prime minister, his vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific will endure. The United States stands with Japan." So President Biden today is rolling out a new plan to, let's say, expand people's ability to get, for instance, abortion pills. It also beefs up Obamacare's birth control coverage. It organizes pro bono lawyers to help defend people criminally charged for seeking or providing abortions. And it's doing all of this through executive action. It comes on the heels of Biden getting a lot of pressure from his own party, not just from the left of his party, but from his party in general, to do more in the wake of the Dobbs decision that reversed Roe. The list of executive action is actually very robust. I don't know that it'll satisfy the left in this case, and I'm curious to get your take on that, Ryan. But it covers a lot of ground, and there's only so much you can do with executive action. He's not necessarily changing the law with executive action so much as he's redirecting federal resources sources and enumerating what his administration's priority is when it comes to, as the action refers to it, abortion medication, when it comes to getting lawyers, getting mobile abortion mobile abortion providers to state borders, all of those different things. What's your reaction, Ryan, as news of this is breaking?
Some of it is good, reasonable, common sense stuff, protecting access to contraception and to the medication, abortion. But some of it is just absolutely infuriating, and particularly because it took so long. So it was May 2nd that Politico reported that the draft opinion had been written, and five Republican justices were going to vote for it. So they've had more than 2 months to come up with this, and a couple of things in there are just infuriatingly vague. Telling the HHS secretary, Javier Becerra, to report back in 30 days about what he's doing, and putting together a panel that involves the Department of Justice and what the Department of Justice can do to defend abortion rights. Like, why wasn't it was the night of May 2nd is when Politico reported it. By noon on May 3rd, you could have those types of orders and panels out. By noon of May 3rd, Biden could have instructed the HHS secretary to tell him within 30 days what he would do if the Supreme Court goes through with this draft opinion. He could have convened this panel of Department of Justice and other people to figure out, what they're going to do to protect abortion rights in the wake of Roe being overturned. That we're here on July 8th. And now he's telling the HHS secretary to report back in 30 days about what he's going to do. I think will drive a lot of people completely insane. It's
shocking to me that they didn't have this ready to go that Friday. It was announced because it's maybe like Chief Justice Roberts, for instance, he submitted a concurring opinion. He did not join the Alito opinion. And there's part of me that wonders if the Biden administration really thought the leak was going to implement enough pressure on Roberts or perhaps Kavanaugh or Barrett, whatever, that they would not join this full-throated Alito opinion. But even if you believe that to be a likely scenario, which I don't know why they would, there's some reasons, but even if they thought that was the case, you still always have your plan for both ready to go. You have your plan A, you have your plan B, no pun intended, obviously. That's what you do if you care about an issue. And obviously the Democratic Party was very focused on Roe and what would happen in a potential post-Roe world. I cannot wrap my head for the life of me around why this list of executive action was not prepped for the moment that decision came down.